Okay. Professor Colin Pritchard, Professor Emeritus at Southampton University in the School of Medicine, Research Professor at Bournemouth University. This clearly adds a veneer of respectability, which stands interestingly alongside the title of this particular recording, which is my part in a war crime. And I hasten to add, it's not my part, it's your part in a war crime, which is an intriguing title for a recording. And I know the story, and it's one that's certainly worth telling. War crime, what are we talking about?
Well, of course, this is going back into the dim, distant past of the 1950s. In fact, in 1956, the British government, along with the French and the Israelis, decided to attack Egypt, who had, the year before, had nationalised the Suez Canal, which the general public, and we're all taught to say, was our canal. And that invasion...
So, I'm going to interrupt. So we were taught to say that it was our canal.
Of course, because we'd run it since Disraeli bought it from the Egyptian Khedive in the 1870s and given it to Queen Victoria. So it gave us a direct and shortened route to India. So strategically, and of course, Churchill had just resigned as Prime Minister, the idea of the canal was directly linked to our jewel in the crown, namely our empire we had in India, which of course had just been, quote, given away, as they said in those days, by the Labour government back to the Indians and the Pakistanis. Now, the whole point of this story of the war crime is that I didn't think it was a war crime. You see, I knew nothing about it, but I was there. And as you'll hear, I was shot at by the Egyptian anti-aircraft guns. I might claim to be the only living British professor to be officially shot at by the Egyptian anti-aircraft guns. I was shot at by the Egyptian counterattack and mortared. Later on in Cyprus, because we were holding down, which was then a colony of ours. Ostensibly, we were stopping a civil war between the Greeks, who wanted unification with Greece, and the Turks, who didn't want unification at all. And I was shot at by what they call insurgents when I was climbing mountains in the Troodos Mountains, even though I had a tin hat on and my red cross.
Okay, so let's go back. So we're at a time post-Second World War, and in the early years of the United Nations. So the United Nations exists, and so I suppose my first question is: Did the United Nations sanction this military action?
Not at all. And if I may, I'll explain why it was a war crime and not a war crime. Because you see, I'm talking about the worm's eye view. I was the first fixed-wing aircraft to land on the El Gamal airfield just outside Cairo when our paratroopers, our lads, had taken it. And I was there at the high point of that Suez invasion. And of course, I saw it very differently, how the politicians, the media, and particularly the British media.
But this is, so from your point of view, you've signed up. Are you a volunteer? Are you who are you?
No, well, can I go back, because what I want our colleagues to understand, because of course in my day every man, unless he was physically disabled, did national service, and that was a 2-year stint. And if on the other hand you wanted to choose your service and choose a trade, you could sign on for 3 years. So I decided to sign on for 3 years. And I shouldn't be telling you this. I signed on for the Royal Air Force because I thought I looked better in blue rather than khaki.
And it was interesting, wasn't it? So how I mean, I think there's an interesting story very quickly as to how you were accepted in as a medic. I think initially you were turned down, weren't you?
I think it's fair to say, you see, I left school at 15. You know, Richard, my mother had died and I had a turbulent adolescence. So perhaps the most embarrassing and humiliating experience of my life was when I went to the recruiting office, and the recruiting sergeant said, "Hey lad, a medic?" There can't be a medic. Sorry, I remember it in dialect, so it's coming out in dialect. You can't be a medic. That's one of the top trades. You've got to be intelligent. You've got to have some qualifications. And all I'd got on my application form was my name, date of birth, place of birth, and a slight smudge, because I'm not a very good writer. So he tried to persuade me to consider other trades, and I said no. So I was about to walk out, and he said, well, look, lad, I'll let you see the officer. Now, of course, the officers are godlike, because one of the things you must understand in the military is social class. Social class is everything.
Okay.
And the NCOs are just well-off working class people, not to be mixed with the officer class. So he let me see the officer, who I now realise was a psychologist. And the first question he asked me was, do you read for pleasure? So of course I read for pleasure. I may have left school at 15, but I read voraciously, a whole range of things, totally untutored, totally unstructured. Dare I say it? I was even reading Freud at age 16 because I saw the word sex in one of the titles. I shouldn't have told you that. And I didn't really understand it. And of course, I don't agree with it now. But I read a lot of history and I loved Shakespeare. So by the time this psychologist and I had a half-an-hour discussion talking literature and asking my interpretation, because at that time I had no O-levels, certainly no A-levels, had no qualification whatsoever. He says, young man, I think you'll do rather well. So I entered. Now, what you need to understand is what happens to an 18-year-old ordinary lad from a working class area, even from a tough area like Yorkshire, Castleford, Yorkshire. The first week you go to kitted out and they give you a uniform, and some of the lads had never worn underpants before. We had one Welsh boy who hardly spoke any English. He didn't know what to do with underpants. I met accents which I couldn't understand, boys from Northern Ireland, Glaswegians, and of course I was called, like everybody else, I was called Yorkie, lads called White were called Chalky, Scots were called Jock, and things like this and so on. And the first week was very nice, and they were very helpful, and they taught us out a little bit of marching and ranks and how to salute and so on. Then we got a train to our basic training at Bridgnorth Royal Air Force. When we got off that train, there was 200 of us, and suddenly we were assaulted verbally and sometimes pushed and knocked over by these drill instructors, these corporals, whose language was all effing and C's and things like that, and screaming at us. We were, and of course what they were busy telling us, we were women, we were pushovers, etc. The whole thing was to humiliate. Now, one of the things about the advantage of being older, you experience life, but you may not understand it. And it's when you can look back on those times and reflect. Now, I realise military training had one objective, to depersonalise you and to dehumanise you, and ultimately to get you into a position, if your corporal would say, shoot, Richard John Williams, I would have shot you. No messing. So what you did, you had this incredible experience of square bashing. We call it square bashing because you'd be on a big concrete square and be marching up and down, totally pointless. You had boots, very heavy boots, which were all kind of crumpled. And what you had to do, which is quite ridiculous, was iron out those crumples and spit and polish, and literally spit and polish. And when I actually said to the officer that my boots were clean, and I said, sir, if you look at them, and the sergeant friend said, spitting all over me, go, okay, well, pardon the expression, I think, speak to the officer like that. So the officer said, look to me, well, airman, I suppose technically they're clean, but they're not as the sergeant wants. And if I were you, airman, I'd do what Sergeant Flynn suggests. And Sergeant Flynn was by my nose like this and shouted at me, and I'm not shouting at you, you silly airman, so just because I hate you. I know the other silly effers at the back can hear you. And that was a kind of language. Then you had things like, we had a firing range because we had to learn to shoot. Now, I had a problem with a rifle because I'm left-handed. So every time I brought the bolt back, the hot cartridge fell in my sleeve, which wasn't very good. But oddly enough, I could re-examine and reassemble a light machine gun, and I was an expert at light machine guns. And of course, you went on a firing range. And then part of the pointlessness of the whole military thing and doing as you were told, you had these little hills where you put your targets. And every flight in their up to 8 weeks moved this small hill 50 yards to the left or 50 yards to the right in barrels, grilled out and sieved out all the bullets, were quite pointless, and rebuild the hill. Then you do things like an assault course. Now, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I was a bandsman, and what every camp had was its own band. And of course, at the end of your 12 weeks basic training, you had a march out and a passing out parade, and the word was passing out parade, and there'd be a band. And most of the bandsmen were taken from the trainee soldiers or the trainee airmen. Yeah. And I was a bandsman. And the day my flight was doing the assault course, I stood to attention to the corporal. It's band practice, corporal. And swear at me. Of course, F off. So off I go to the band, and I'm a tuba, and I come back. And of course, at the end of it, they've all done the assault course. So I report back to the corporal, stood to rigid attention. So you're effing skiver. Do you know what a skiver means?
I certainly do, yes.
Oh, you know what a skiver does. Some of our younger colleagues may not. It means a chap who cheats and gets out of things, yes. Pleasant things. So he addressed my flight of 50 lads. Shall we make Pritchard do the assault course? This effing bandsman. And what's your trade going to be, Pritchard? I said, it's a medic, corporal. A medic and a bandsman, bloody hell. So I had to do the assault course by myself. And what he did, he got the lads to boo me. And because they were booing me half-heartedly. I got across the assault course. Then he said, shall he do it again? And all the lads said, yes. And this time I went through the gas chamber without a gas mask on. When I came out the other side, I'm nearly dying. Of course, it would not be allowed in these soft.
I think in days when we're not allowed to abuse people. I think
well, exactly.
Yeah.
At this time, my lads started cheering me, and of course, the whole military thing was to bond you, but not to bond you too closely, because the one thing they were worried about was the eroticization of any male bonding, etc. And the whole thing about this thing was the depersonalization and the humiliation, and therefore, most of the time you were described as women, because you must realize the world was totally sexist.
Yeah.
And then, Richard, something wonderful happened. About the 8th or 9th week, the corporal had got us doing some drills, bayonet practice, whatever it was. And then he said, right then, men. I was 6 feet tall. Our corporal called us men. And this was all about. So when we could bully the juniors, we bullied them. When we could scare the youngsters, the chaps who had just come in the second week, we would do so. And it was all hierarchical. And of course, we couldn't speak to the officers because the officers were gentlemen. As you learn later, you know, as you and I, social workers, we become gentlemen, or rather we become officers, but I'm no gentleman. So finally, at the end of 12 weeks, if my NCO had told me to shoot John Williams,
you would have done it.
I would have shot you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would have obeyed an order.
Followed orders,
that's
absolutely,
order.
Unquestioningly.
Unquestioned, the hierarchy. And that's the most important thing. So I then had 6 months of training, which was technically nursing attendant class 3, which really was a kind of assistant nurse training, which made you safe on a ward. But it was really brilliantly military because they reduced it to the essentials. So we didn't learn much anatomy and physiology, but we know how the body worked.
Yeah.
Which, of course, what I then realized when I was actually looking after airmen later on in the sick quarters and the hospitals, most of the lads hadn't a clue where their body was. So perhaps I shouldn't do this, but if I said to our group, not where is the spleen, the pancreas or the liver, do they know what the spleen, pancreas and liver does? My guess is a lot may not. And in those days, our lads were like me, they'd all left school at 15. They had no idea of their bodies and so on. And of course, the sex education we got was really summed up in one little phrase, immortal phrase, flies spread diseases, keep yours buttoned up. Sorry. Then, of course, the whole thing about the military, when there's not a war on, is to prepare you for the military, for a conflict. And then I was very lucky. I did an advanced training, 6 months training at Royal Air Force Hospital, Halton, where I was trained officially to be able to deal with the emergency medical needs of 100 men in the field.
Wow.
In effect, I became a paramedic.
Gosh, yes.
And then I got this wonderful training, air casualty emergency evacuation. And this is where my part in a war crime begins. Because part of the air casualty emergency evacuation was training, was you went on flights. Now, most of our colleagues have been flying, I suspect, not in the aeroplanes we flew in. These were known as Valettas. Officially, we all call them pigs. You might have flown at 10,000, perhaps 12,000 feet. The noise was indescribable. There was no air conditioning. So you froze, you actually had to have jackets on to stop you freezing. And when you, for example, my first training flight was to Germany, we had to have heaters on the few patients we brought back from Germany back to to Britain, and to have heaters on them because we had no internal heating whatsoever. So in fact, one long flight, you're absolutely exhausted.
Yeah.
The next flight was to Malta, another training flight. This is super. Then the next flight was to Cyprus. That was fun. And then finally to Hong Kong, where I'll tell you a little bit of a digression. There on the Royal Air Force at Changi Airport, Royal Air Force, there was this memorial to lads who'd lost their lives in the Second World War. And one of my lads was saying, because this time, I'm a corporal and I have a team of 4 working to me. And I say, stand up, and he stands up. I say, go, and he goeth. And if I want, I'll say, don't you speak to me, boy. Stand up, come here. And he came. And most of the time, you're reasonably friendly. And he said, these Japanese, etc. And I simply said to him, because my hobby was history, well, we're no better than the Japanese. How do you think we got Hong Kong? And they said, well, how do you mean we got Hong Kong? It's our empire. I said, well, how do you think we got it? Well, it's ours. No, I said, we conquered it. Our empire, we were brutal, vicious pirates who then became respectable. Oh, so that has a link in a moment. So I'm now trained as an air casualty emergency evacuation. And then suddenly NASA nationalizes the British Canal.
And NASA, just to be clear, NASA was the president of Egypt.
Yeah. And the Prime Minister at the time was Churchill's successor, Anthony Eden, who wanted to make a big splash. But we now know that he was a bit of an inadequate. He felt overawed by Churchill, etc., and all the rest of it. And he, if anybody's watched The Crown on Netflix or whatever it is, he actually lied to the Queen, because the British government, along with the French and the Israelis, decided to invade Suez totally illegally.
So when we say illegally, presumably the British government sanctioned it, and the French government sanctioned it, and the Israeli government sanctioned it. So what we're saying in terms of the illegality is that
against the United Nations
UN
international law.
Yeah,
it wasn't sanctioned. What the British and French said, in fact, what first happened, The Israelis did their first attack, so naturally the Egyptians moved to the Israeli front. Then we, the French and the British governments, because you see, hear that, I'm a serviceman, it's our government, it's our lads. I identify with what I'm told. I'm identified with the lies I'm told.
Yeah.
We said, we're going to stop the Israelis and the Egyptians because they'll damage the canal, that international waterway. So this is not a military action, this is a police action. Now, what was interesting about this, you may not believe this because it was so simple. We'd been taken to Cyprus in July, and there were 50 medics, and there was an air quartermaster there who'd been in the Second World War, had salad, a lot of campaign medals, and he said, "Hey up, there's something up. I've never seen as many medics since D-Day." But we were told when we went to Cyprus in July, because we didn't invade until actually the last day in October, that we're there to deal with all the insurgency and the conflict between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. And we didn't know any better. And in our NAFI, that is where we're all fed, it's the kind of canteen, we were shown military newsreels showing this man Makarios, who was the leader of the Greek Cypriots. So we
Bishop Makarios, yeah, okay.
Makarios, you may remember.
Yeah. I do, yeah.
Actually, Richard, you're not much young. No, you're not as much. You are much younger than me, but not all that younger. Sorry, that's naughty of me. You're only 20 years younger.
Yeah.
But there we are. Anyway, 20 years younger, but you remember Makarios. So naturally, we servicemen booed. Then Makarios was invited by President Nasser to go to Cairo. And the British cameras were there. So you saw Makarios and Nasser together. So we booed. Then they showed us Nasser by himself, and we servicemen booed. It was pure Pavlov's dogs.
Yeah. Effective propaganda. Yeah.
Hadn't a clue. Then as there's more and more troops coming to Cyprus, and of course we had nothing to do, but because we were medics and there was some nasty burnings and shootings and blowing up in Cyprus, and because I was at the hospital, so I saw a lot of carnage. And in this sense, I'm an intellectual pacifist, not because of what I saw then, because in one sense, one shouldn't say this, but you are trained to take pride in being able to deal with a burned body or a drowned body or a body that had been literally blown up to smithereens. People may see games and television, etc. They never show you what a hand grenade or a mortar shell can do to a human body, and you don't want to see it. No. But we saw a lot of that. But we also we suddenly found French troops yes. on what was then a British colony. So I'm saying, hey, I'm in the Corporal Smith. What are French troops doing in a British colony? And the officer heard me and said, "Pritchard, Corporal, you've read too many books. None of that, or you're an officer," which means I'd be charged with conduct, counter good discipline.
Knowledge is a dangerous thing, especially if you share it.
Thing, because you mustn't become known as a barrackroom lawyer.
Yeah.
You see, this is what the class system does to you. As soon as you have an intelligent non-commissioned officer or a serviceman, an airman or a private, asking intelligent questions, the officers call you a barrackroom lawyer. By putting a label on you, it stops people asking questions. And we were taught to boo Nasser. And then we were told about the police action. Now, of course, you must remember, this is 1956. All of us remember the Holocaust. All of us seen the horrors. And somebody like me as a democratic socialist, we admired Israel enormously because it was a democratic country. It was a secular country. It was a socialist country. It had the wonderful thing of kibbutzim. It had so many wonderful things about it. So when we were told we were going in as a police action, we all went willingly.
Yeah.
So the padders go in on the 31st, and I leave Cyprus at midnight, and we're flying, and of course the turbulence is up and down and God knows what, and you think, my goodness, what the hell is it? It's pretty horrible. And then suddenly you get all this cloud, this funny kind of cloud, and I've got an air quartermaster, because his lads are going to take all the equipment we're selling. You know, we've got all ammunition equipment in our aeroplane, and my team, when they get the equipment out, my lads will make it in an ambulance and I'll go and get the casualties. And there's all this funny cloud. And I said to the air quartermaster, flight, he's a flight sergeant, that means he's 2 ranks above me. What funny cloud? Cloud, you silly ABC. That's not cloud, that's flak. And you know, he said, show the lousy servicemen. I said, they can't shoot at me, I'm a medic. And they were shooting me. Anyway, we come down and everything else and this and so on. I mean, on the other hand, so I've got my hat on. My lads help the other lads and off we go. I get to the perimeter and suddenly the Egyptians are counter-attacking, and I'm thinking, oh, hang on, what's going on here? And suddenly this paratroop sergeant said, get your effing head down. You realise the only common English language was the effing word. Get your head down. And I did, flapped. I realised, my God, this is serious. And I didn't have a smile on the face. It was shit frightening, frankly. But having said that, then he said to me, it's always good to have a medic around. Richard, back to my training. I was 6 foot tall. I dealt with what I had to deal with. I dealt with what I had to deal with. And yes, I took pride. The Suez crisis lasted barely 3 weeks. The Americans accused us under President Eisenhower of an illegal war. We were condemned. We were condemned in the United Nations Security Council. We didn't use the word war crime. But the war was over and we all came back. And of course, we servicemen felt we'd been cheated because, of course, the poor Egyptians were waging war on 2 fronts. And we had massive air power. It was a massacre. We were murderers. We were murderers. But we didn't see it that way, Richard, because we'd been shaped differently. Just tell you just a few more things, because I want to show you about the other kind of war crime I took part in. When Suez was over, we were bored to death with nothing to do. So I did actually play a game of rugby for the Royal Air Force Middle East Command, which we had to stop half time because they had so many fractures and everything else and so forth. The only try I ever scored in the whole of my career was in that one. And on the radio that night, Radio Cyprus, run by the military, they got my name wrong. It was Richards who scored your name, Richards who scored the try, it wasn't, it was Pritchard, which is a bit annoying. But having said that, I got myself attached to the army just to do something. The whole thing about the military, how it's inclusive. You want to be part of them and they want to be part of you. You know you can rely on your mates, and I can rely on them. So one of the episodes, some of my lads, my team, wanted to go into Nicosia, the city, but we had to have 3 rifles and a Sten gun, and only NCOs could have a Sten gun. So they go and get a Sten gun. So I go to the Royal Air Force regiment we call rock apes, because they're thick as 2 short planks. I didn't say that. We simply call them rock apes. But they're the soldiers who normally guard the airfields, you see. So I go to the flight sergeant. I want to do some Sten gun. So he gives me a Sten gun, and we're on this promontory on the sea.
What could possibly go wrong?
Target. I pull the trigger. This is not funny, it's bloody dangerous. Everybody has to throw themselves down. So the flight sergeant comes up, get off my effing range, you silly da-da-da-da. And they are, here's your effing chitty, go and shoot some sips. Yeah. Right, so I was dangerous. Now, I've now got a chitty to fire a Sten gun. So one evening, 3 or 4 days later, I'm asked to ride shotgun into Nicosia to bring some of our nurses back who'd been at the civilian hospital. My driver says he knows a shortcut, etc. Stupid man gets us into a bit of a mess, very narrow. Suddenly there's a crowd round. Now there's the ambulance. There's this hole where the guard, that's me with my Sten gun, is riding shotgun. Suddenly this crowd comes around, yelling their heads off, throwing bricks, etc., and wrecking the ambulance and so on. Now I'm worried. I've got the women, the nurses in the back. I'm very frightened, etc. Now we've got rules of engagement. This is indoctrinated in you. You only fire, you warn, one firing shot, then you shoot to kill. That is if life and property are endangered. So I'm telling my driver, ring his bell, flash his light, get in bottom gear, move slowly, but for God's sake, don't run over anybody. And we're moving ever so slowly. There's bricks flying around. I'm shouting them in Greek and Turkish, halt stamata or I'll fire. So I'm giving them warning. But being the kind of lad I was, I gave them 3 warnings. By the time my 3 warnings, I'm getting worried. There's bricks around my head. I take the safety catch off and I'm within 5 seconds of firing. My driver's got a bit of impetus and we're away. The trouble is, if I'd have been a different kind of lad, instead of 5 seconds late, I might have enjoyed firing 5 seconds earlier. Fast forward. I'm not sure I should be telling you this. I'm not sure one should take pride in it. We, with the army, were dealt with there, and we knew there's going to be a demonstration, some religious demonstration, and I was in charge of the medics supporting the infantry, and they'd all got these kind of big shields with holes in and batons and all tin hats. I got a tin hat on and of course, my Red Cross. The crowd charge, etc., bricks and sticks and God knows what, and our lads push them back. And one lad's hurt, but the line takes them back. So we've only got 1 casualty. So we're dealing with him, and it wasn't much. So I took my armband off, picked his shield up and his baton. To be the lads, I joined the line. Legitimately, I'm defending my mates, helping the army. That's what I'm there to. This is putting down civilian unrest. I can still see the bloke who came at me. I knocked hell out of him. Knocked hell out of him. All legally, all under the rules of engagement. Nobody was killed. We cleared the square. And I thought myself, wasn't I a clever little lad? Because I'm 20. I've been indoctrinated to sexism that colleagues today have no idea. It's all about hierarchy and proving yourself a man, because that's what the military are there. You've got to prove yourself a man. Then finally, perhaps the last story about war crimes. Things are quiet, or penultimate one. We had a Greek Cypriot clerk called George, and he comes in that morning and he says, "Morning, Corp." I said, "Morning, George." And suddenly, bang, smell, crash, screams of agony, etc. I go out and there's George on his face. You can see the cordite, and I knew you heard his bum is up, and you can see what's happened. A large hole, a red hole in his backside. One recognised straight away he'd got a detonator in his back pocket and he'd gone up. I'm trying to deal with him, trying to keep him calm, looking at the wound, etc. A medical officer, gentleman, a doctor comes up. "Corporal, you seem to be dealing with it. What would you recommend, Corporal?" I said, "Well, look, sir, it looks as if the detonators cauterized." That meant, you know, literally burnt off all the blood vessels. so he's not bleeding. I said, Lysol pack and strapping, sir. Yes, and what else? I said, Trebonic ampule of morphia. Corporal, in the circumstances, I think 2 aspirins. Not morphia, 2 aspirins. We then hand George over to the snowdrops, and these are the police, who every serviceman hates military police. In the army, they're red caps. In the Air Force, they're snowdrops. I played rugby with them. When I'm playing rugby with them, they're all right. But when they've got the snowdrops on, we all hate them. We all, etc. A week later, they came back, and I had to deal with George's dislocated fingers. And I said, well, how did this happen? They said, he fell downstairs, said the corporal, the other corporal, handing him over to me. And I suddenly realised, of course, that the police station where the snowdrops were based was a bungalow. A bungalow. One other. The army regiment I was attached to, I've got it out of sequence, was they'd been in Cyprus for a number of years, and as a gesture, they wanted to be nice to the village where they'd been, because they actually made a football ground or a sports ground, and they built the people a water fountain. And there was a football match going on, and the water fountain had been booby-trapped, and when the lads pressed the button for the water, it had blown up. Now, we medics always took a pride in getting to the incident before the fire brigade or the police. That's what we were doing. So I was there first on the scene. 3 lads were killed outright. I had to do some tourniquets, dashing around, morphine, writing, etc. when the medical lot came up, etc. But it was really a bit of a mess. The rest of the servicemen went round that village and took every bloke they could find and knocked the hell out of him. Now, of course, they shouldn't have done that. It was illegal. I suspect if there had been servicemen of a different nationality, as what happened in Vietnam and things, there might have been deaths. To this day, I cannot condemn them, because what they saw their lads. They had no idea why the Greeks were angry at the presence of the English. You know, the servicemen, for example, who served in Northern Ireland had no idea that really Britain shouldn't be in Ireland. You know, that when you realise the history, when, for example, we were protecting our empire. And, you know, we call the Mau Mau in Kenya, where President Obama's grandfather actually fought against the British Army. We were in our newsreels, these men were using spears and brutal methods. We were using aircraft and guns and tanks against black, you know, almost unarmed civilians. So my war crime, was it a war crime? I didn't think it was. When we flew back, I arrived on King's Cross Station, going for 2 weeks leave. I got my chitty, and I was so proud of myself. After all, I'd done what my dad's generation. I'd been to war. I dealt with it. I'd done the job I was trained to do. I looked after my lads. I was proud. I'd been taught to be proud. So I wore my Middle East uniform, which is, you know, very light, etc., on the Sunday before Christmas on King's Cross Station. And this woman came up to me because I'd got a kit bag. And on the kit bag, I shouldn't be telling you the words like this, but bash the jippos, bash the sips, because that's the language we were taught. We were taught. And she said, were you at Suez? And I thought I was going to be told I was a hero. Yes, I said, you know better than the Nazis. I was totally, I didn't understand what she said. Richard, it took me 10 years to discover that the British, French and Israeli governments had committed a war crime which I, at Worm's level, had been part of. That was my part in a war crime. I wrote a letter at the 60th anniversary of the Suez Crisis in The Guardian, And and I actually asked the question, I realised I was on the wrong side in Suez. I wonder whether my comrades who served in Iraq and Afghanistan wonder whether they were on the right side.
That's a powerful question.
Can't hear you, Richard.
That's a powerful question to reflect upon.
Sorry, I can't hear.
No, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, but that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm going to stop it now.
Yeah, of course. As I said, the wrong